Story 1. Yes, all the time. I attend Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and post-traumatic stress disorder support groups with people I personally arrested. I frequently spend time with them in sober settings. Before all that, I ran into a man I had given a Christmas cookie and a Camel menthol cigarette to while waiting to be seen at the emergency room. He looked across the bar, noticed me, whispered to his friend, and the bartender brought me a glass of top-shelf whiskey. Payback for treating him like a human. He turned every screw on my Camaro and assembled the Procharger every 6 months. I went to his funeral this summer. Treat people the way you want to be treated. If you cannot say that you do, it is time for change. Story 2. Yes. I ran into one at my next job. He was a larger man with a level head who had influence in the unit. I sometimes worked with him to mediate issues. He shook my hand and we talked about what had been happening since we left jail. He seemed to be getting his act together and staying out of trouble. Treat people fairly and you are more likely to get a handshake than anything threatening. Story 3. I saw a man in Walmart who knew me from prison. He seemed familiar, but I couldn't remember any specifics about him, which usually means he is not a jerk. I saw him recognize me and start heading my way. I quietly alerted my wife in case she needed to get the kids away, though I doubted anything would happen. He reintroduced himself. It turned out he had been one of my workers and thanked me for being chill. The only other time we crossed paths was in a store where he avoided me. He seemed not to want his prison life and his new life with his family present to collide. I respected that, nodded, and moved on. Story 4. I am not a prison guard. I am a jail deputy. I see former inmates all the time. I try to treat them with fairness and dignity while they are inside, and I have yet to receive anything but kindness from them on the outside. Last summer I was at a minor league baseball game when I noticed a large group of former inmates sitting behind me. They were repeat offenders, so I had known them for years. I sat with them and asked what the occasion was. They were proud to tell me they were all in residential rehabilitation together and that their program had taken them to a baseball game. It was wonderful to see how proud they were of their sobriety. I introduced them to my wife and children. It was a very special experience. Story 5. One of my brother's best friends is a recently retired prison guard. I think he served nearly 30 years. He has run into several former inmates and said the encounters have been mostly unremarkable. A nod or a brief hello. A few have gone out of their way to say hello and to let him know they have been doing well on the outside. He says he does not worry much because he did not go out of his way to be cruel. Story 6. I see them at Walmart all the time. Most of the time it is just a little nod and a smile. Sometimes it is a handshake or a fist bump. One man introduced me to his wife by saying, "He was the only one who treated us like we were human." I do not enjoy being a correctional officer, but I think I have to be there to balance out the assholes. Story 7. My husband is not on Reddit, so I am answering for him. A man approached him at our corner store, excited to see him. He invited my husband to his house across the street to see a cat my husband likes that the man had taken home from prison. Luckily, there have been no run-ins since, and my husband did not go to see the cat. He simply said he was glad the man was doing well and walked away. Story 8. I am a former prisoner. I've run into 3 guards. With all 3 I shook hands, shared a brief hug, and did a lot of catching up. I saw a different guard at Walmart while I was with my wife and kids. I instantly went beet red, started sweating, and had to leave. When I worked at my prison job, he would stare at me while I was naked, including my genitals. It was embarrassing. I swore I would beat him up if I ever caught him outside. But I didn't. I walked away and explained it to my wife. Story 9. Yes, but they never had bad intentions. I was a female correctional officer in an all-male maximum security facility with about 3,000 inmates, so it could have gone bad quickly. It never did, and they were usually excited to show me that they had done something positive, real, and lawful with their lives. I was calm and fair, so I never had any problems on the inside either. One of the men lives in the same small community as I do. He was just an 18-year-old with a short sentence. He was a menace but mostly harmless. Story 10. I have been working for more than 31 years as a correctional officer. I have seen a few inmates out and about and never had an issue. I always treated them with respect until they proved otherwise. I am a dinosaur now, and when I am at work and see an old-timer, we usually tell each other that we are too old for this job. I am retiring in January. Goodbye, tension. Hello, pension. Story 11. It was fine. I was thanked for treating him like a human. Most men in the general population are just people who were caught doing something stupid. People convicted of sexual offenses against children were in their own protective custody unit and did not receive the same treatment. Story 12. I am a former correctional officer at a state prison. I had quit a few months earlier because the job was terrible and had returned to college. One night at a bar, a man came up and said I looked familiar, then kept returning every few minutes. At that point, I was about 100 miles from the prison and did not socialize outside my circle, so I was fairly certain the man who was bothering me had been incarcerated. When I asked, he admitted he had been in prison. I did not recognize him because with more than 2,000 offenders, you do not remember anyone outside the regular troublemakers. He asked me for money. I used the most important correctional officer skill, saying no. Story 13. I worked in a jail for 15 years. I see my guys all the time. Laughs. During my time, I worked on some of our most troubled floors, the special housing unit, the mental health floor, and the minor unit when New York used to house 16, 17, and 18-year-olds in adult jails. The law has since changed. Usually when I see homeless people, it is someone from the mental health floor. I always stop and talk to them and help them out with whatever I have. Most people who know me now do not know I used to work there. So they look at me like I am crazy when they see me talking to these men. Laughs. One time, leaving church, I saw a man going through a dumpster. He was someone I knew from the special housing unit and he was happy to see me. He told me the first book he ever read was because of me. I had apparently given him a book. Inmates usually remember more about you than you remember them. Another man got a job at a nearby gas station and would give me free coffee. I saw other men at Golden Corral and at church. If I am not sure whether their family, girlfriend, or wife knows they were incarcerated, I do not bring it up unless they do first. I saw a young man at Walmart with his mother. He introduced me to her and we had a good conversation because he was doing very well, and I was happy to hear it. Usually you never hear success stories about people, only when they die or get arrested again. In 15 years, I know of at least 33 of my guys who were killed on the streets. That is often sad because you get to know some of them very well. I had one young man from my floor whom I saw working at Walmart. His mugshot went viral and he was so happy. He was actually making t-shirts of them. Laughs. Most people thought he was crying and that he was going to snitch on everybody. He had actually been pepper sprayed before coming into custody. Laughs. Story 14. I was not a correctional officer. I was a former inmate. I was in a CVS pharmacy a few months after the last sentence I had served when I heard someone yell my last name. I turned around and one of my correctional officers was running toward me and gave me a hug. He was kind and helped me fix my glasses when they fell off my bunk and broke, since we rarely had an eye doctor there. I will never forget that. I am so blind without them that I was legitimately panicking. Story 15. I ran into one of them at Walmart. He greeted me by name and asked how I was doing. He had never caused trouble inside. I told him I was proud of him for staying free. He had been out about 3 or 4 years and was doing well. We shook hands and went on our way. It was hardly a thrilling encounter. Story 16. Most interactions were good. I worked in a county jail in a large college town. One bad incident involved a man who had been booked the night before. He was high on methamphetamine and arrived combative. We had to restrain him to get him clothed and into his cell because he was out of his wits and aggressive. The next evening, as I returned to work, I stopped at the convenience store near the facility, and he had just been released. He was in a car with another person driving. He saw me, and they pulled into the parking lot. He immediately jumped out of the car and threatened to kill me. I told him to leave before he wound up back in jail, and he continued to threaten me. I did not see any weapons on him, but I could not see the person in the car, and that made me nervous. I had a gun in my vehicle, but I was not going for it unless I felt I was in imminent danger. He threatened me some more and then drove off. Note: I was a correctional officer from 2004 to 2012 and am not currently serving. I am sure things have changed. Story 17. A man called out to me at McDonald's shortly after being released. When he saw my son with me, he apologized profusely, saying he had only been saying hello. Story 18. When I was a nurse in a prison, a former inmate contacted me on Grindr. The inmate said, "I want to fuck you up the ass." I made some small talk with him and encouraged him to stay on the right path. The inmate asked, "Is that a no?" Story 19. I am not a prison guard. I am an inmate firefighter crew captain in California. I have not run into any in the wild, but I have seen several former inmates who are now firefighters on various fires. It is great to see them doing well. Story 20. I was a guard when I was about 21. I did it for 1 year and then quit. I was at a bar when a Hispanic man asked if I worked at a certain facility. I replied, "Depends." Was I nice? He said I was one of the cool ones. We took several shots and partied. My mother was a guard for a long time. My family is still friends with a former inmate who became mayor and sits on the town board. In a prison town, many inmates end up in the community. It behooves you to be a decent guard. Story 21. Different situation. I was working in the emergency department as a paramedic, and we had a psychiatric patient who was huge, about 6 feet 5 inches and 300 pounds. We had to sedate him and place a urinary catheter to obtain a urine sample for urinalysis and toxicology screening. He was extremely aggressive and thrashing, spitting, punching, and trying to bite. It was tough because it was the beginning of a 16-hour shift for me. After his initial intake, I became occupied with other tasks and did not see him again. I finished my shift at 11 p.m. and stopped at a gas station for a snack. I heard the door jingle and the man walked in. He locked eyes with me and shouted, "You!" I thought he was going to attack me in the gas station. He came bounding toward me and I braced for impact. Instead, he gave me a giant bear hug, was very apologetic, and insisted on buying my snack, saying I had saved his life. It was especially unsettling given that I had placed a urinary catheter 16 hours earlier. He had been medically cleared. Allegedly, he had stopped taking his medications and had started abusing other drugs. It was frightening. I thought he might harm me. Instead, he bought me a free cinnamon roll. Story 22. Yes, it goes fine. If you treat people with respect and as human beings, you will usually get the same in return. Story 23. My trustee for my pod applied for a job where I had been the store manager a year after I left corrections. I hired him and he was an excellent worker. Story 24. County jailer, 6 years. I am a petite woman. One time a huge man came barreling through the Dollar General yelling, "Miss, miss." My daughter looked at me in terror. The man said, "Remember me?" I recognized him. I said, "How are you doing, Jim Bob?" Yes, that was his real name. He was so happy to see me. He said he was staying out of trouble and told my daughter I was a good person. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 47. Story 25. My mom was at Reedsville in Georgia and at the women's prison there as well. She ran into different women in Atlanta, and they were always happy to see each other. They thanked her for treating them like humans. Too bad she could not do that with her family. Story 26. I worked at a women's prison as a man in a rural state. I no longer live there and I am no longer a correctional officer, but many former inmates have struck up conversations with me, told me how their lives are going, and said they appreciated being treated like people instead of animals. Story 27. I am a former juvenile delinquent. A pair of brothers were security guards, really cool guys. Fast forward. I was managing a convenience store when a postal worker came in who looked like them and had the same last name. It was their dad. Fast forward again. While supervising at a call center, I saw the last name once more. It belonged to the older brother. He was so far gone on methamphetamine with face tattoos, missing teeth, and poor skin, and there he was in my cubicle so I could correct his grammar. Fast forward. I later saw the older brother's name on the front page of the local paper. He had kidnapped his girlfriend, tied her up in a storage unit with electrical cords, held her hostage, and eventually killed her. I have met many of my former correction staff members, and with the exception of the above story, those encounters have all been positive. Story 28. I worked as an art teacher at a minimum security facility where prisoners, no matter how egregious their crimes, were serving the ends of their sentences and could be relied upon not to escape. I never knew what they had done to get there. The prison authorities stressed during training that the inmates had plenty of time to note your license plate, the make of your car, and any information you mentioned to them, however innocently, so I was circumspect. There was a Native American man who was a talented artist, and a few years after I stopped working there, he called me. He found me in a different town by calling my unlisted landline, years before the internet. We had a brief chat. I mentioned I had a boyfriend, and that was that. I was surprised. Story 29. It was not me, but my dad worked in corrections for about 30 years. When I was a child, strangers would approach him and greet him as if they were old friends, only later to learn they were inmates. He was respectful and professional at work, and the inmates recognized that and treated him with the same respect. Story 30. I was working a side job on a busy street in a large city when a man with his wife and child walked up on the sidewalk. He made eye contact, but I did not know where I knew him from. I assumed high school because I had attended a large high school. We exchanged a handshake and a hug. He said he thought I did not remember him. I apologized. He then said I had been the correctional officer in his unit for a while and thanked me for being a good person. I told him it was great that he had been released and that he was doing well, and I wished him luck. At my prison, there were inmates ranging from legitimate terrorists to drug dealers. Since I did not remember him, he must have been incarcerated for a less serious offense. Story 31. I was not a prison guard but a former probation and parole worker, not an officer. I knew so many people and have seen quite a few in real life. Even when visiting out of town, we covered my entire state, and I saw people I recognized from my work screen. None of them knew me. It was a faceless operation, but some may have recognized my voice, so I kept quiet. Story 32. When I was a jail nurse, I sometimes saw inmates out in public. If they said hello, I always acknowledged them. I told them I was happy to see them living a normal life. Once, at a laundromat, one of my well-known inmates was there. He told me about his life and his job. He was with his wife, and she did not look too impressed that we were talking. I quickly looked at her, introduced myself, and explained he knew me because I had been the jail nurse. Her whole demeanor changed. She then told me they were expecting another baby, which was why he was helping with the laundry. I told her he had been very respectful toward the nurses and that I hoped everything went well. Story 33. My mother was a nurse at the regional center in Nebraska during the 1960s and 1970s, and she told me many crazy stories. Once, while she was out shopping, a man who had escaped from the facility came into the store and walked up behind her to say hello. She was thinking, what the heck? He turned out to be one of the serial killers. She kept him talking so long that the police arrived and arrested him. He had escaped, not been let out. Story 34. Juvenile Hall. I have had 2 encounters. Remember, because of Senate Bill 823 in California, people can be housed in juvenile facilities until age 25 under specific conditions. 1. The first man was a brawler. I was with my wife and told her to walk away so he would not associate us. I moved toward the front of the store. Thankfully, he never saw me. 2. The second man was actually working. He said he recognized me and then said my last name. I knew nothing would happen because he was working, but it was still an uncomfortable feeling. Story 35. I ran into a man who had been an inmate while my dad was working. While he was in prison, he told my dad he was going to rape my mom and kill my sister and me. He recognized my name because I had said it out loud at the pharmacy. He said he hoped my dad was doing well, then went to the next person in line. It was unsettling. Story 36. A friend of mine was a correctional officer at the county jail, not a prison guard. My friend and I lived together for a few years after he stopped working as a correctional officer. I asked another friend if he knew anyone in the city who sold weed. He said yes and sent me his friend's contact information. I contacted the man and told him who I was and where I got his number. We met up, and my friend, the former correctional officer, was with me. When the man walked out of his house, I noticed my friend cock his head slightly. I asked what was wrong, and he said he thought he recognized the man. When the man reached the car window and noticed my friend in the passenger seat, he said, "Hey, weren't you my correctional officer?" My friend laughed, said he thought he recognized him, and asked how he had been. We had a good conversation, shared a laugh, and went home. Story 37. I have seen 3 incidents. One involved a man pressing people for money, including my girlfriend who was not next to me. I asked him if his parole officer knew what he was doing. He left quickly. The second involved my fiancée, the same person, and her Swiss friend wandering away from me at a Detroit Tigers baseball game. Both are 6-foot-tall blondes and stood out in the crowd. I saw a former inmate approach them and say something. They turned and I was too far away to do anything but yell. He left quickly. The third was very pleasant. He had an entry-level job and seemed very happy. Story 38. I'm in a small town and there's only one jail for the whole territory, so I run into inmates often. Sometimes I'm invited to have a drink with them. Other times they avoid me or give only a quick nod. Most interestingly, I was outside the grocery store talking to my former supervisor from the jail when an ex-inmate approached, quite drunk. We made quick small talk and then tried to leave. He insisted on having a drink and showed he could pay by producing a handful of cash. I politely declined. He took offense and started saying, "I'm not a bad guy." And I could see his anger building. I've dealt with him on and off for years. My former supervisor positioned herself behind him, and I made sure my hands were free. I managed to calm him down and send him on his way. Pretty anticlimactic, I guess. Story 39. I am not an ex-prison guard, but about 10 or 11 years ago, I associated with some less than favorable individuals. The day I met my wife and my stepson, who is now almost 10 years old, I stopped talking to those people and stopped doing stupid things. Even now, I still get random Facebook message requests I do not open or Snapchat friend requests from people whose screen names I recognize. I live only a few towns and one major city away from them, and to this day when I am out with my wife and our 3 kids I still keep an eye out for them because, frankly, they were crash-outs then and they are crash-outs now. Story 40. I have been recognized countless times at Walmart, gas stations, and other places. And after 10 years working in corrections and detention, I have never had a bad encounter. I love seeing people who were frequent visitors and have turned their lives around, and I enjoy hearing how much their lives have changed. People often thank me for keeping it real and being a cool guard, but I simply treat people like people. It is not hard to be kind to someone who is at rock bottom. Story 41. I am the inmate in the situation. I ran into a correctional officer while I was at the county fair with my family. He seemed a little startled when I said his name. He did not remember me at all. He was one of the more relaxed correctional officers I got along with. Otherwise, I would not have said hello. Story 42. Yes, it was a great experience. I knew him for about 9 years before he was paroled, and it was rewarding to watch him take the program seriously. After his parole, he reached out to me on Instagram, and we have kept in regular contact. It has been years now, and he is doing well. Story 43. I was a correctional officer for 7 years and eventually became the barber at the facility. I was always consistent in whatever area I worked. I saw a former detainee at a Home Depot. He gave me a hug and introduced me to his wife and 2 children in the parking lot. I was no longer working at the facility, but I will never forget that interaction. Story 44. I see them quite often. I have never had an issue. I treat people with respect and as human beings, and they respect that. I saw one at our state fair a couple of years later. He went out of his way to introduce me to his wife and child and told them I was always cool and didn't treat him negatively just because of his situation. Generally, if you treat people with dignity and respect, they give it back. Story 45. I was not a prison guard, but I worked in a jail. I saw one man every few months. He kept being released on his own recognizance. One day, while walking in downtown Orlando, I saw him lying down. I went to shake him awake, but he was already dead. It turned out to be an overdose. It was the worst day of my life. He had so much to offer. Story 46. I was not a prison guard but a student worker. I graduated and moved on. I was working for a small business, and as we were taking out the trash, a car stopped in front of the building, and a man greeted me like a long-lost friend. He turned out to be a former inmate. My boss walked out. I told him I needed him to walk me to my car and to make sure no one was following me. Story 47. I used to do building maintenance in a jail and a courthouse. I have seen old friends and school buddies in jail. The first couple of times it is weird, then you get used to it. A jail, as opposed to a prison, is mostly full of people who live around you, people arrested for driving while intoxicated, domestic issues, theft, and crimes related to addiction. There are always a few major criminals waiting for trial, but most are in prison. Story 48. A few times throughout my career, when former inmates approached me, I asked how they were and made small talk. I never approach anyone in case they do not want their past brought up. I have also had several men over the years threaten to find me and harm me when they were released. I was never too worried. I would likely be low on their list. I truly never did more than necessary to keep the place safe, but such threats still register in your mind when there is a strange noise late at night. Story 49. My dad was a corrections officer and must have treated the prisoners well, because, when I was growing up, they often came up to him and called his name as if they had seen an old friend. Story 50. Yeah. I had retired from detention work after a decade. After a year working for a hotel, I landed a job teaching at a small, now defunct college. On my first day of training, one of my former inmates came into class about 15 minutes late with a classmate. He spotted me sitting with the soon-to-be former teacher, going over some things, and froze. "I know you." "Yes, you do?" I said, trying to hide how nervous I was. More worried about losing my job than about getting hurt. "You're Mr. Action," he said, using my real name. "Yes, I am Floyd." I nodded. He spun around and tried to run, but he misjudged the door and smashed face-first into the door frame. He fell flat on his back. All of us in the room jumped up because he hit hard. Floyd scrambled and bear-crawled through the door at a pretty good speed. The man who had come in with him looked after Floyd, looked at me, looked after him again, then sauntered back out the same way he had come in. The soon-to-be former teacher and all three students stared at me for a few seconds until I shrugged and went back to what we had been doing. Story 51. I am not a correctional officer. I am a kitchen supervisor in a county facility. I have only seen one former inmate on the outside after working in the kitchen. He gave a quick nod and I returned it. Whenever one of my workers is about to be released, I tell them the same thing. Good luck, and I hope I never see you again. Story 52. Chill. I'm not an asshole. I do my job. I only act stupid when inmates act stupid. It was a casual encounter, a head nod, and we moved on. Story 53. I was not a correctional officer. I worked as a mental health clinician contractor inside a state prison for a year. I left that position to work at a private residential treatment facility. I have seen no fewer than 5 former inmates come through as patients. 3 were on my caseload at the prison. During my orientation, I was told that 90% of the inmates you interact with will be released within your lifetime. I already intended to treat everyone with respect and humanity, but that statistic helped me remember it during tough days. Thank goodness I did, because they all remembered me and told me I had a solid reputation on the yard. The handshakes and thank yous I received felt more gratifying. Story 54. The abusive guards who deserved whatever they got are not going to post here. So these answers are going to be biased toward wholesome. Story 55. I'm not a prison guard, but my uncle went to prison when I was in elementary school. By the time he was released, I was in college and he had become thin, so it wasn't easy. Story 56. He was renovating the neighbor's house and saw me standing by my parents' burned barrel. He asked if he knew me from somewhere. He added that he had not been back in 6 months and that he was staying clean in Colorado. Story 57. I worked in corrections for 4 years at the local county jail. I see former inmates often. I have always treated them with respect and had a professional relationship with most of them. If I run into someone at a local store or gas station, It is usually a brief exchange asking how we have been. People should be treated with respect and as human beings. Story 58. My father ran into someone about 15 years after he retired as a commanding officer. We stopped to eat at a roadside barbecue joint in rural Georgia, and the cook looked at him and said, "Mr. J, you were my motivation to turn my life around." The cook put his soul into those ribs. It was the best lunch I have ever had. Story 59. My doorbell rang and someone was at the door trying to sell home security systems. When I looked closer, I recognized him from jail and asked if he had been incarcerated before. He then recognized me and said he was at the wrong house selling a security system. I asked what he had been incarcerated for, and he said breaking and entering. I am not sure how he got that job. Story 60. Former correctional officer here. I ran into one of my former inmates about a year after he was released. I was in line at a grocery store when someone called out, "Hey, Correctional Officer Smith." I turned around and instantly recognized him, which made my stomach drop for a second. He smiled and stuck out his hand. He said he had been sober since getting out, had a steady job, and was trying to regain custody of his daughter. We talked for a few minutes and he thanked me for treating him like a human being when many officers did not. Inside the facility you try to keep emotional distance, so seeing him doing well on the outside was pretty cool. It was one of the rare times running into a former inmate did not make me tense. Story 61. I laugh out loud every day. I live in a regional town. Most of the time they are very friendly. I am still cautious, though. Story 62. Yes, many. I was decent and not power hungry. They all nodded and walked on. One said, "Hey boss," as they passed. I know of a couple of officers who have been spat on and one who was beaten because they were arseholes when they did not need to be. Story 63. I taught general educational development at a house of correction for several years. At the time I lived next door to the local halfway house, so the men who went there would always hoot and holler and say hello when they saw me. One time someone wrote my name is dust on my car. I also taught women and ran into one of my former students working at Target. All were pleasant interactions, but I saw a different side of the inmates. I know they are far from perfect, but I had good relationships with my students and was happy to see them after their release. Story 64. I was not a prison guard, but I served time. The correctional officer in charge of my pod was in the news a few months after I was released. He had robbed a pharmacy. Story 65. I'm not a prison guard, but I imagine it would be a great feeling to see someone from inside put their life together. Story 66. I saw her on the street while I was running errands. She had an ankle monitor, so she was on probation. When she saw me, she wanted a hug, but I stopped her. She was very nice and we chatted for a bit. She planned to move somewhere better and find work to get back on her feet. It was good to see her outside and to see that she wanted to turn her life around. Story 67. One of the inmates I worked with had truly worked on himself and changed during his time there. He had a parole hearing, and I volunteered to testify to help him obtain early release. He was granted early release, and I left the prison to pursue a new career in aviation and return to school. Although I was no longer working there, we stayed in touch. He is doing well and is now married. Story 68. My friend's dad was a guard, and he said that sometimes they bump into former inmates. Most just avoid eye contact, but a few actually thank him for being fair. Apparently, it is surprisingly emotional. Story 69. I've seen a few out and about and never had a problem. I even had one come to my door to deliver a parcel from Amazon. We chatted briefly about how he was doing and whether he was keeping out of trouble, and then he left without incident. Story 70. I was not a guard, but I processed certificates for industry training in a specific field. Licensing for trade courses that are renewed periodically. We delivered training to the general public and to local prisons. I saw the same names every cycle. One morning, while working through stacks of completed forms, I noticed a familiar name. An inmate had come to renew his license at the general public course, indicating he was continuing in the trade and had a job on the outside. I updated his address for mailing his certificate, replacing the generic prison address with the new home address on the form. Felt good. Story 71. I was neither a guard nor an inmate. One night I was out at a local pub and ran into a man I knew. He was talking to another man and introduced me. The other man had been a correctional officer when my friend was in prison. They asked if I wanted to do a line. I politely declined. Story 72. He seemed like he did not want his prison life and his new life to collide. When I was in graduate school, I worked in our university library. Newly released inmates would often come to use our computers since they did not have one at their halfway house nearby. They had to apply for jobs and then surf the web. We rarely had issues. To use a computer, we had to present identification. I wasn't sure why. It was just university policy for outside users. Their state-issued identification cards resembled driver's licenses, but the photos showed them wearing the same white work shirt, not a typical driver's license photo. One day, a particularly nice man handed me his identification and I casually asked, "I'm curious because I have no concept of how things work there. Do they take your picture before you are processed out, or is this a standard picture from when you are in?" He became very uncomfortable and pretended not to understand. After a few minutes, he came back and said, "Hey, I have to level with you. I'm sorry, I kind of lied. I just feel like people would judge me if they knew I'd been locked up." I smiled and told him I did not care that he had been incarcerated or what he had been incarcerated for. I explained, "You did your time. Nobody should hold a past mistake against you once you've paid for it. You and the rest of the men are fine with me." That put him at ease, and he would strike up a conversation every other day when he came in. The rest of the men who came in with him warmed up to me after that. They had been standoffish before. They brought me the coffee urn when it needed filling, told me when the printer ran out of paper, and helped in other small ways. That group eventually moved on, and I would see new groups from time to time. They all had a particular look, the same barber, the same toiletries, the same thrift store wardrobe, but I never connected with later groups the way I did with that one. When new groups arrived unannounced, I could tell because you do not often see a group of middle-aged men with tattoos from clearly different socio-demographic backgrounds enter together. I would explain the library policy, point out the free coffee, describe how the printing service worked, and offer help with job applications so they would know what resources were available. Some were friendly, but none were as relaxed and open as that first group. Story 73. One of my patients listed his former parole officer as his next of kin. His reporting period had ended more than a decade earlier, and I thought it was nice that they had remained in contact. Story 74. Saw one of my former foyer janitors at the local Winco Foods. He approached me to say hello, thanked me for being fair, and told me about the local projects he is involved with on the outside, such as serving as a peer mentor to people who have been released and are on probation. I was happy to see and hear that. That release was 8 years ago, and he has not returned to prison. More recently, on my way home from work, I saw a man involved in gang activity being tackled by the local police department. It varies. At Winco Foods, I see many of these people. Story 75. A former lieutenant, he knew who I was and I knew who he was. We locked eyes and nodded. He rang up my purchase and said, "Have a good day, sir." I replied, "It's already better knowing you are doing okay." That was it. Story 76. I see them all the time. I always stop for a chat and ask how life is going. If they are with someone, I do not mention their incarceration. My experiences with inmates are always positive, both inside and outside. For reference, I work in a prison in the Netherlands. We have different kinds of prisons in the Netherlands. At the one where I work, inmates have a lot of freedom to move around within the walls if they have somewhere to be, such as work, a doctor appointment, or visiting hours. Story 77. This is about a coworker. He was a correctional officer working in the jail, although I am not sure of the official name. He applied for our current industrial job. The company runs apprenticeships and hired him and one of his former inmates, who had been released from prison, for the same position. They worked together during the apprenticeship because they started at the same time. When someone needed something, they would call cop and robber. The former inmate was later fired. Story 78. I used to be a correctional officer about 4 years ago. I've had 2 experiences with former inmates. The first, I was approached while pumping gas. He was struggling and wanted food, so I bought him a sandwich and took him to some local resources. The second, I was at a park. He rode by me a few times on a bike and then approached, saying how all the correctional officers had done him wrong. I had a fanny pack with my phone and wallet in it, so thinking we were about to fight, I turned my body so my side would face away from him and put my hand on the pack to make sure it was closed. He stopped and rode away. In retrospect, I realized it looked like I was reaching for a holster. That was one of the few times I had left my house without my gun. Funnily enough. Story 79. This was about 20 years ago. I am no longer in corrections. At the time, I was working at a regional jail. I had a direct satellite television service installed at my house. The installer was a former inmate of mine. He did not recognize me at first, but by the end of the appointment he did. He did not mention it directly, but he called me by my last name the way inmates did in the jail, so I knew he recognized me. His work was fine and it was not awkward. I was glad to see him succeeding. Because of my employer's rules, I had to submit an incident report when I returned to work, but nothing came of it. Story 80. This is why I love Reddit. Someone posed an interesting question. I assumed we would get a bunch of stories about fights and threatening behavior and so on. Instead, we received many stories about people treating other people like human beings. Treat all people with dignity and respect. Story 81. When I was a teenager, my best friend's mother got out of prison. She married one of the prison guards, and they had another child together. It was bizarre. My husband's grandmother was a public defender for juveniles. I remember young people approaching her, thanking her, and being goofy with her. It was sweet to see. Story 82. It's fascinating to hear these stories. Many inmates face significant challenges once they're released, from finding jobs to reintegrating into society. A guard might see someone who was once a troubled youth come back as a changed person, working hard to turn their life around. It's also a reminder of how important support systems and rehabilitation programs can be. Have any guards had a particularly memorable encounter with a former inmate that inspired them? Story 83. I am not a guard myself, but a close family member worked in corrections for years. One day he ran into a former inmate at a supermarket. They recognized each other instantly. The man told him he was clean, working, and had a family. My family member said that moment stayed with him forever. Story 84. Yes, many times. Sometimes I have given a big hug. Yes, we can still love people. One man glared at me in the parking lot. He said, "Hey, where do I know you?" I said, "From work." His eyes widened. He said, "Oh, hey," and shook my hand. Others looked and knew me but did not want to associate, and that is fine. Story 85. Hey, my boyfriend used to be a guard at the jail when I was in and out in my early 20s. I met him years later at a bar in my 30s and we hit it off. I've calmed down since then and have managed to stay out of trouble, but I can still be a handful sometimes. Story 86. I'm not a prison guard, but I volunteered with a reentry program in the United States, so I met many former inmates after their release. What always surprised me was how clearly they remembered the guards who treated them with basic respect. Even small things like speaking to them normally or listening when they were having a rough day stuck with them for years. I once ran into a former inmate at a grocery store in Texas. He told me he'd been sober for almost a year and had steady work. He specifically mentioned one deputy who encouraged him while he was incarcerated, and said it made him feel like he still had a chance. Moments like that made me realize how much simple fairness can change someone's direction after release. Story 87. Absolutely. Small town stuff in Pennsylvania. I saw them at the bar. They bought a round with no issue. Story 88. I've had several inmates run into me in public, even with my family standing next to me, and all the interactions have gone very well. A few who were released have called the prison every year on their release date to ask for me and tell me how they were doing. Story 89. Hundreds of times I have encountered someone on the street. The interactions are overwhelmingly positive, short chats about how they are doing and that they are staying clean. However, 2 encounters turned negative many years apart. Both instances ended with the previously incarcerated person being detained again. Story 90. I have worked in a prison for 5 years as a case manager and have seen many of our clients in the community. I have a personal policy of acting as if I do not know them unless they speak to me. I will not walk up to someone in a grocery store and, unsolicited, ask if they are sober or how they are doing on parole. There is a small percentage of people I avoid because they were difficult to work with or I can clearly see they are not sober. Story 91. I was never a prison guard, but I worked as a security guard in a halfway house. I do not know where he is now or whether he had left that life at the time, but he was near the top of a local gang. We were on good terms. One night he told me that, although the job seemed good, I should not go further into it because nothing good would come of it. Story 92. I was arrested on post in the Army at 19 for underage drinking. The military police officer who arrested me is now the father of my 2 sons. I am 36 and he works as a sergeant at a state prison. He is still good with handcuffs. Story 93. I was at a bar with a woman I was dating. I got a tap on my shoulder, and there he was. He called my last name. We talked and he bought me a beer. Story 94. My buddy was a prison guard for a few years and has post-traumatic stress disorder because of it, so it was not fun. We ran into a man at a gas station who wanted my buddy to know he was straight and doing well. Story 95. I'm telling this out of order because I was the inmate. I ran into a husband and wife pair of guards I knew at a bar where I was setting up for a band I worked for. They recognized me, and I walked over and talked with them for a couple of minutes. I told the bartender they were on my tab that night. They stayed for a couple of hours, then said goodbye when they left. There was no animosity or anything strange. They were just normal people. As guards, they were professional, with no issues or rude behavior. Sorry if you expected a salacious story, but there was none to be had. Story 96. Often, I greeted them by name so they knew I recognized them. When they were on the outside, they usually avoided doing anything that would get them sent back. While I did my job, I treated them with respect. Maybe that helped. I do not know. Story 97. This was about 30 years ago. We were shopping at Kmart when a man walked up to us and called my father by his last name. My father said, "Hey," and immediately had all of us leave the store. It was nothing crazy, but I will never forget it. Laughing out loud. Story 98. I have seen plenty and never had any issues. Some were a simple head nod. Others were a bit more social. At the end of the day, as long as they were treated with respect, there were no issues. Story 99. I am a social worker and have seen 2 clients outside of jail. Neither wanted anything to do with me, and both were still living on the street. It is very sad. Story 100. I went to rehab once and encountered a former inmate and a guard from the same prison. The officer had been abusive toward him while he was incarcerated. During group therapy in the classroom, the former inmate berated, yelled at, and insulted the officer. He was uncomfortable. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.